Skye opened her eyes, looking at the glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling. That was so long ago. Almost 10 years now. Being little kids, they couldn't have ever guessed that the city that they lived in was actually the sleepiest and the safest. They were still only dark incidents, at most 3 times a year. Most of their dark hunters were dispatched to other towns and cities where the cases were much, much worse. Unless Skye and the 4 of her friends decided to move out of the city, the likelihood of them becoming the youngest dark hunters was a distant dream. The trade-off for staying there is that they would receive the best training here. While most dark hunters were shipped out of the city, many were shipped in for training. Despite that, her friends were fun people, and whether they became the youngest dark hunters or not, she'd hope that they'd keep having new adventures every day. Even if they just stayed and became patrollers. Skye shook her head, rubbed her eyes, and stretched. Her friends would laugh if they'd known that she even considered it. Skye took in her room. Her dad was making breakfast by the smell of things. She got up and got ready before following this delicious smell of bacon to the dining room. The air was different than she expected, though. Normally, downstairs was lively and full of excited chatter in the mornings. Instead, it was slightly tense and quiet. Her mother was sipping coffee, her eyebrows knitted together as she stood behind Skye's father, whose nose was buried in a newspaper. Both looked concerned. Skye sat down, unable to take her eyes from them as she poured herself a glass of juice. "They're replacing Master Castlewell," Skye's mother said. Skye nearly spit out her juice. Castlewell had been there since the huge invasion. "Did you hear anything about that?" Her mother looked up from her coffee while her father looked over the newspaper at Skye. "No!" she exclaimed, looking between her parents. "Who are they replacing him with?" Skye scooted out of her chair loudly, nearly spilling her juice, and stumbled over to the paper her parents were reading. "A Headmaster Thomas Brown." Skye paused a moment, tapping her glass in thought. Why did that name sound so familiar to her? She sipped thoughtfully, eyes narrowed at the newspaper as if it would give her the answer she wanted. "Whoa, isn't he one of the great descendants from the war?" a voice asked from the entryway. Skye nodded in recognition. "Ah, yes, Brown. Descended from Matthias Brown all those years ago." The Browns were looked highly upon since their family was the most famous from the Great War, but they were sort of snobs. Skye could never manage to talk to any of them. Skye looked toward the entryway, realizing the voice wasn't that of her family's. Whose voice was that? Aryan Pendragon entered the room with a huge grin on his face. Skye smiled at her friend and went to sit back down. Skye returned to her place at the table. "You're early today," Skye said, picking up a slice of bacon. Aryan smiled, putting his fists on his hips. Skye's stomach became unsettled. Uh-oh. Skye hurried, all but inhaling her food. She thanked her parents, then pulled Aryan towards the front door. Aryan waved to Skye's parents before he was pulled out of view. The pair started towards the school. Skye couldn't understand why Headmaster Castlewell had been replaced. It didn't sound like he had passed away, especially since the technology hadn't gone crazy last night. At least, not on this side of the city, where he lived. Technology was a wonderful and terrible thing. It made things easier, but for whatever reason, when anyone died, all the technology within a 20-mile radius would make an awful metallic screeching. Scientists weren't completely sure why, but decided it was possible that the fragmenting of the soul somehow messed with the frequency. It was something Aryan had tried to explain over and over to Skye, but she just couldn't wrap her head around it. "Headmaster Brown, huh?" Aryan said, almost like he had read Skye's mind. "I bet he paid off Castlewell to be headmaster." Skye furrowed her brow. She wouldn't put it past the Browns to pull a stunt like that, but why was it so suddenly? There was no real explanation that she could come up with. But why? Skye asked. Aryan was thoughtful for a moment. To stir something up in the city? Skye looked at her friend thoughtfully. What would he say to her if she told him she was thinking of just staying here and being one of the patrollers? She looked away. Skye and her best friend, Trish Whitaker, had always been the two most avid about becoming dark hunters. Aryan might tell her not to give up now just because they won't wind up being the youngest, or he might scold her because she'd thought of this for so long and never said anything. Aryan, Skye started, I've been thinking a lot lately. She stared at the ground as she walked, wondering how to form the words. What if he laughed at her? Sounds dangerous, he joked. Skye jabbed him in the ribs. She was relieved that it eased the tension a little bit, but it didn't stop her heart pounding in her ears. He chuckled. Sorry. You've been thinking? About being a dark hunter. She stopped and stared down at her own scuffed-up shoes. He looked over his shoulder at her, slowing to a stop as well. What about it? When she didn't answer right away, Aryan wondered if she was all right, and turned to her fully, furrowing his brow. He reached out to her. Skye? Skye Starrett, you would never believe what I just found out! Trish all but tackled Skye. She pushed the excited girl off of her, looking to the other two girls, who looked like they'd just run to catch up. We already heard about the headmaster. Aryan was clearly annoyed. Skye almost never talked seriously about anything when Trish was around. He wasn't sure when he'd talk to Skye again about it, or if she'd even remember. He pulled Skye to her feet. She began brushing the dust off her uniform. No, it's not about that, Trish insisted. There was another dark attack again last night. Aryan and Skye exchanged a glance. That's 3 this year, Skye said, and it's only August. Trish nodded solemnly. That's why they're replacing all the headmasters with trained descendants. Her friend's words soaked in. Skye almost couldn't breathe. It was like the darks were more frequent now. Right after she'd been thinking about how trashing that idea about being a dark hunter. Was it some kind of sign? Where are all the patrollers? Skye asked, testing the waters. Trish laughed loudly. Aryan rolled his eyes and continued walking to the school. The others followed. They're a bunch of jokes. Are you kidding me? Trish managed through bursts of laughter. They'd find them sleeping, on the job, all the time. Skye felt her cheeks redden. This is exactly what she feared would happen if she told her friends what she was really thinking. Easiest pay in the city, I bet. You know, besides being a descendant. Skye looked up at the school. I guess so, she said absently. Skye sat in class, head propped up on her hand, staring towards the window. This city had been sleepy for so long. Why was it suddenly waking up with dark activity? And what's more, the higher-ups in the city were so concerned that they were moving real descendants to the schools to oversee the training. The school Skye attended was particularly for those who sought to continue their dark training. It was more advanced in dark subjects than other schools, but it narrowed down further up the chain. Once Skye graduated next year, she had a choice of Ainsworth Academy, the best dark hunter academy to attend, Marlowe, the medical school which studied darks or trained its students for battlefield healing, or the general education school that Skye could never remember the name of. Most patrollers studied there, but there were other branches of it. One that Skye had considered at one time was their culinary course. Culinary was silly for a dark hunter to learn, since most dark hunters are almost always traveling. She'd almost never be home to cook for anyone. Skye sighed, resting her head on her folded arms on top of her desk. Why was this all getting complicated now?